Daniel Boetker joining us from Australia at an insanely late hour, and he's been super nice and accommodating about it. So we'll make sure not to have him snooze off in the middle of this call at some point. But welcome to Guftgu and National Library Week over here at Offset. It's just an excuse to get us to talk more about libraries, actually, nothing else. For those of you who have been attending our previous conversations, you might know a little bit about our format, but for those of you who are joining us fresh, Guftgu is an Urdu word which literally translates into casual conversations, which is what we intend to do, but sprinkle in the casual bit and, actually begin to start understanding what it means to be engaged in a world where photo books are being consumed and read, images are being read, and the book is becoming a format that we are using a lot for self-expression and self-activism even, Libraries, of course, come to the core of the book form. They have traditionally been the central form of dissemination, much before books became accessible, which they still are not, in India and the regions around here as much, both in terms of institutionally, but definitely financially, I would say. And so we're gonna be talking to Daniel, who started, I think, the first collection of an Asia-Pacific identity as far as photo books are concerned. Am I right in assuming that, Daniel?
I'm not sure. Maybe. Okay. But firstly, maybe the kind of the most kind of organized one, let's say.
Okay, let's let's say. So that's the only one I had access to, and I was. It was very interesting. We got to meet each other at the Angkor Photo Festival, where Daniel was doing a pop-up of the library, and I do think in many ways it kind of put in a seed in my head, regarding how we even carry around, offset in a trunk, unlike a suitcase. But how actually, why do books need to be inside institutions, inside very defined structures, and why can't we just take them out of there and have them access photographers, non-photographers, students, grandparents, or whoever might be interested? Before we get into the conversation, I just wanted to give a brief introduction to Daniel, who has a large history of engagement with photography, I do have to say. He's an educator and he teaches, he's the Dean of Studies at PSC, which is the Photography Studies College in Melbourne. But he's also a writer and a curator on photography. He is a photographer himself and has also dealt with publishing within photography, from what I have recently found out. And Daniel's a regular contributor to the British Journal of Photography, GUP Magazine, European Photography, Vault, Photo Eye, Paper Journal, and a lot of Australian and international publications. He's the director of Asia-Pacific Photobook Archive, which is a not-for-profit library of self-published and independent photo books, and has curated from the archive and outside of it as well, if I'm right on that. Thank you for joining us today, Daniel, and for sharing your processes, which you will in due course of this conversation, but sharing your thoughts and your processes with creation of the archive, and maybe also wondering where it stands today. Just to kind of start right from the beginning in some ways, I think I wanted to know what is the photo book for you? Like, when you think about the photo book, and the idea of the book has, of course, transformed massively from literature to now art-based books even, but more so today, where the book is almost a sculptural form even. And I was curious to know, for you personally and for the archive, what is the photo book and where does it stand in relation to the other books?
Well, that's really a question that can't be answered simply. I think lots of people have actually tried to define what a photo book is. So I guess in terms of the archive, a photo book is whatever someone decides to submit to the archive.
Right.
So the way that we define it is if someone has defined their own book as a photo book and they've submitted it to the photo book archive, then it's a photo book. So we have books in the archive that are is a whole book of text with one image, for example. Okay. And the person who made that book decided it was a photo book and therefore submitted it. So therefore it's a photo book. So I think, if in terms of trying to define it, I think if the photographer or the bookmaker has decided it's a photo book, then it's a photo book, whatever that means. But I guess in terms of the kind of general understanding of the photo book, you're right, really over the last probably 20 years, really the photo book has had an explosion internationally. And that therefore means that actually the diversity of what people have been trying to do with the photo book and people's inclination to try and test the boundaries of what that means has grown as well. So, we can talk about some examples as we go through, but in terms of the idea of what a traditional book is, I don't think the photo book really has ever actually adhered to those rules, even if you go back to Ed Ruscha in the 1960s and 70s, making the kind of making the Sunset Strip book. That in itself was then that was related back to other histories of artist books and different kind of histories. So really, the photo book doesn't really have one kind of structure or one kind of mode or one kind of practice. It's really a amalgamation of lots of different things. And obviously, like you said, it's borrowed from literature, from artist books, borrowed from sculpture, borrowed from a variety of different kind of backgrounds, really.
Right.
So the answer is I don't know.
You don't know.
What a photo book is. I still don't know
the absolute answer to that. I mean, it is something that I think we're all trying to make sense of and grapple with, because like you mentioned, I mean, the relationship between text and image has, of course, been, it's kind of run parallel to each other in many ways, right from, the earliest photo books that we have seen, whether they were formats that were just recording events or recording objects or even discussing, ideas of self-expression. Over the years, of course, the graphic element, I think, in the photo book has begun to take a more tangible form. It's begun to organize itself in some ways, I think, and become more pronounced in where the book stands today. And it's always a bit of a conflict, I feel like, because in some cases you feel that the idea of the design can sometimes overpower photography, even, the photographic element of the book even. And traditionally we've kind of always looked at that as not something that's very encouraging in a self-published book, let's just say, or a self-realized book. But of course, slowly, like, photographers are then also becoming designers in some ways and are also looking at text differently, looking at the role of how they, place the text very, very differently. Of course, text has also been photographic in many ways. We have a really interesting dummy with us in our little library, which is by a photographer who now lives in Goa, by the name of Alaknanda Nag. And she's actually been working on this. The book is about attachment and detachment, but she does it using the context of a slowly disappearing Armenian community in India, which is not really known about as much. And in many ways, I mean, a lot of her images are not very direct and literal, but a lot of her text is, in my opinion, I mean, I consider the text almost as photographic, and it's been interesting to see how photographers are also adapting these other mediums in their practice, and maybe by that definition, photographers are no longer only photographers in that sense, or photographers in that sense. And that's, I think, in the wake of like how technology has been coming into our lives, a big question that has come up is this, that can photographers sustain themselves or survive purely within the dynamic of the photograph itself? I obviously have very little idea about the context of how the practice is in Australia, but it would be nice to know, your thoughts, since you've obviously been seeing different kinds of work, both from a student and a professional space, emerge out of that. I mean, what do you think about that? Is it a time that photographers need to not be just photographers, as they say?
Well, I think rather than that, I think I'd frame the question slightly differently. I think what I would say is that what are the opportunities that the photo book has provided for photographers over the last, well, forever, but, particularly if we're talking about over the last kind of 20 years where printing has become kind of cheaper, where access to kind of small run kind of self-published publishing has increased across the world, even for students, but also for professional photographers too. And I think the question really is, what has the photo book kind of afforded photographers? And it has afforded them the chance to explore their kind of storytelling techniques, their storytelling kind of explorations and experimentations. And, I think Dianita Singh, for example, would say photographers need to be book experts. They need to control the book and make the book themselves and design it and have control over every part of it. Now, I sort of think that's good for photographers who are good at doing that, but for photographers who aren't good at making books or need help with design, then I think the book does allow them a certain element of experimentation, but also then allows them to collaborate, and allows them to bring in experts from areas that they might not have expertise in to play off and have conversations with and produce something that's kind of unique and collaborative as well, Right. So I think in a way the photo book has, on the one hand, allowed more people to see photography in a different kind of context. And it's also allowed photographers to explore their practice, because I think in a photo book, more than anywhere else, you can really see where your story isn't working, or where your story is weakest, or where your photographs aren't working properly, or where your technique or your or your idea that you kind of been working on isn't working. And I think when you start to sequence a photo book and you start to put it together, it becomes very obvious very quickly where the weak points are, should we say, or
Maybe that's why they take so much longer to be realized as well.
Yeah, maybe that's right. Yeah.
But I mean, of course, in the Southeast Asia region, I mean, keeping Japan and to a certain degree, maybe certain pockets of China, separate from this, the boom in the photo book world has been still fairly recent. And again, I'm not very sure about Asia-Pacific. That's something that you can tell me about. But I was curious to know how the idea for an archive as opposed to a library kind of came about. Although you in functionality, you do have aspects of the library that are very, very relevant. How that came about, and also why and how you chose the geographical space that you did, which is Asia Pacific. If you could just kind of talk about that, that would be really nice.
Yeah, I mean, it was a slow kind of process, really, in that I had from Australia originally, but then have spent lots of time in Europe studying and working. And I came back to Australia in 2009, I think it was 2010. And immediately kind of worked out that there was this strange kind of relationship that Australia has and still has with Europe and America, where it somehow the photography community kind of, certainly at that time, and it's getting a lot better in Australia, but certainly even just 10, 15 years ago, kind of looked over the rest of the world and just looked directly to Europe and America to see what was kind of going on in photography.
Right.
And so when I came back and started teaching and getting involved in the photography kind of community here, I was really interested in exploring what was going on my kind of doorstep, really, in terms of in Southeast Asia particularly, and Asia more generally. And so the process really for me was a slow one, where I just started to reach out to a variety of different kind of groups and communities in the region, and just talking to them about what was kind of going on in terms of book publishing and education as well. Right. And then also starting to visit, you mentioned Angkor Photo Festival, starting to visit other festivals like that, Obscura Festival in Malaysia, festivals in Japan and Singapore, and also reaching out to other places in I think you've spoken to Huawei in Manila, and a few other people. And so there's people that I'm still friends with now, of course, who I reached out to at the time, and just to really find out what was kind of going on. And then really wanted to think about the kind of power structures that were in place, really, in terms of photo book publishing, in that most of the photo books that we kind of consume are from Europe, really, and America, and particularly Europe. And really wanting to kind of challenge that, and really wanting to kind of, recognize that there are photographers who are talented in this region, and the only reason that they're not known is because they haven't had the platform for their work to be seen. That's really it, because the population of Indonesia is the same as the population of the United States. So therefore, there must be thousands of great photographers in Indonesia. We just don't know about them, and we just happen to know about the thousands of good photographers in America, because America economically, is able to, Americans, economically, are able to get their work out there. They're able to promote their work. They're able to get it published. They're able to visit festivals. They're able to do all those things. And so it's really an economic and geographic kind of limitation, really. Not even a limitation, just an issue.
Right.
And so I guess the archive really then came about as a response to that, and wanting to, in a selfish way, wanting to kind of educate myself about what was going on in my region, and wanting to have a community of photographers that wasn't dependent on Europe and America, really, because I was kind of over that a bit.
Right.
And wanting to kind of have a community in this region that I knew existed, and just wanted to kind of tap into it, really. And so then the logical next step then was to think about how to kind of structure that. So I started going to festivals and started talking to people about organizing this collection, and asking people to donate books, and also buying lots of books as well. And then really just finding a space in Melbourne and just putting some books in there and setting it up, really. Yeah. And I guess the main kind of, the crux of the kind of project is that you said, this idea of the notion of the archive and the library. And I guess I chose the archive because I thought, well, at some point, the idea is hopefully it continues, and at some point it becomes something big enough to call it an archive, and something kind of culturally rich enough as well, that researchers and people that are interested in the history of the photo book at this time and in the past might use it as a resource for research, really. So I guess that's why I went with the notion of the archive rather than the library. But it's true also that the archive doesn't really operate as an archive as such, because we do take books around the place. So one of the key kind of features of the archive is that we take collections of books all over the world to show them different festivals and different events. So it's a static archive in that its home is in Melbourne, but it's never been static. We always have, we're always going to events overseas, in Asia, in Australia, in New Zealand more closely, but also in Europe and in America. And we're constantly taking books that are submitted to these places, not so much in the last year, unfortunately, but previously.
Understandably so.
Yeah. And we also do, you know, we also have a program where, for example, we've probably collaborated with about, I don't know, a dozen or so festivals where they haven't necessarily had the money to pay for a ticket for one of us to fly over to wherever it is. Right. So I run the archive with Isabella Capezio, who runs the archive with me. So, and you've met her at festivals previously. And so she's the one that, she's the one that sort of tells me what to do, really. And so we have a kind of program really that if a festival can't afford for one of us to kind of go over there and take the books, then they can actually kind of get a box of books sent to the festival, and they just have to pay for the shipping of the box. And then they can have a kind of show at the festival of books of, it might be a themed kind of collection, it might be from a particular country, it might be just books by particular photographers, it might be something more broad. And so that happens a lot as well, where we'll ship boxes of books to places, and then they get kind of sent back. I think there's one box of books still in Europe from a festival at the end of last year that hasn't been sent back yet, actually. That reminded me. But
it's taking a bit of time to get back.
That's right. So that's one part of it, is that the archive is open to those kind of collaborations. And, you know, we've done events at the Photographers Gallery in London, at Landskrona Festival in Europe. We've done stuff in New York and San Francisco. We've done stuff in all over Europe, really, different festivals. And as I said, also in Japan, in Singapore, in Malaysia, in the Philippines, and in India as well, and different festivals. So I guess the key thing for us is that the reason people would submit a book to the archive is that it would be seen in a number of different places. So it's just one copy that sits in the archive, but actually that book also has the possibility to travel, because there's lots of collections of books at the moment that are out there in the world that people are asking to submit. People are asking photographers to submit their books to, which is fine. And I think that's great. I think it's great for those collections to exist and for people to send them books, and for those places to kind of have visitors. But I feel like that's not enough for me, because we're in Melbourne. It's quite, you know, it's a long way away from lots of different places. And so I think it's really important for me that the collection is here, but also we travel a lot with it and take it to places. So the possibility is that a book that's submitted might go to 5 different events in a couple of years, you know? And that certainly happened. And that there's certainly, out of that, there's certainly photographers from this region that have had exhibitions and have had features in magazines and have been invited to be included in a variety of events because their books have been seen through an archive event in Europe or America or something, you know?
Right. I just wanted to, taking from this point itself, I mean, you know, like you mentioned, that there are, of course, multiple libraries that are now also emerging, which I think it's a healthy practice in some ways, because sometimes, you know, they might be able to access to regionality, you know, that might not be possible, you know, when you're talking about like, you know, conversations or even interactions or knowledge about what's happening across countries. But I mean, I was curious to know, like you mentioned, this archive has existed for a fairly long time in Melbourne and traveled through it. So you have been seeing books that are recent, contemporary, and maybe even older publications that maybe authors or publishers have been sending in. I mean, one of the things I was very curious to know about is, how do you make sense of this archive? You know, because in many ways, one can also begin to understand if there are particular movements in photo book history or certain trends, and then, you know, kind of also begin to understand what those trends or context might even mean for photography, but also in terms of whether, you know, at one point of time when you thought about photo books from India, they were a particular kind. And now when you see photo books from India, they're kind of on, you know, the other end of that spectrum. So, so I mean, I'm curious to know, as someone who's obviously been witness to a history of photo books from that region, Are there any specific interesting movements or observations that you've had over the years?
Well, I guess that's really tricky. I think the
Because
thing
you
to
don't
say.
have to be perfectly accurate about
No,
it.
no, no, but I think the thing to say though, and the thing that's really exciting is that there are lots of photographers who have sent books in who are making work in the region and who are making books where their experimentation and the way that they're experimenting with the book as a form and as a vehicle, I think their experimentation is actually different and unique and much more interesting than perhaps is what's going on in other places in the world. And I think that's to do with I think where it's most interesting, it's where it's drawing on cultural influences from their own country or from other
Right.
countries of the region, where they're also referencing European or Japanese or American influences, and then they're kind of processing that internally, and then it's kind of coming out with some local influence, and they then might attend some festivals where they meet people from another part of the Asia-Pacific region, and then they're
Right.
talking about that work. And so I think there's some really interesting books that are being produced that are kind of unique to the particular countries they're coming from, and
Right.
I think that's really exciting. And that's really, only been in the last kind of 20 years. Like, you're right, I think that, black and white photojournalism really was pervasive across the whole region, really,
Right.
until very recently. And I think that has a lot to do with the festivals that have popped up. I think it has a lot to do with people like you, and people like other people who are really engaged in promoting work from this region, exploring work from this region, encouraging young photographers, and trying to think about ways of storytelling that aren't directly just kind of borrowing from European and American models, but actually are engaged in something a bit more kind of local. And that's why I kind of started the archive when I did, because I kind of knew that in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, that this kind of explosion of books from the region would happen. It was really just a matter of time,
Right.
It was really just a matter of time that photographers from this region started to really explore the book. And, the benefits of the book are that you can produce something quite simply and cheaply, but also you can have total control over everything about it, and that's the difference, say, between a book and an exhibition, or well, not really an exhibition, but a book and a gallery, a website or an exhibition, is that the book can present the story, but also it can travel to other places, and you can control how the reader kind of absorbs it, because you're giving them the thing that you made. So they have to, it's in their hands, and so
Right.
you're kind of taking them on a journey, which is sort of some way under your control, but also obviously as soon as you hand over the book, it becomes something that they can control.
That's for sure. As much as we'd
Yeah.
like to control every single aspect of the impact and the engagement our work would have, we invariably have none, I believe. But actually, it's kind of interesting because, again, in India, I think what actually catapulted, the idea of photo books was the idea of access. To be able to print locally and realize that I'm just going to put up a Facebook post about this book, and make, maybe 500 to 700 is usually the run that works, in the region here. I guess in Asia Pacific it's similar as well, but at the same time, I think at the same time there's been this trend where even if you do have these 700 books and you produce them, at the end of the day, I feel they're going to people who are within your Facebook world or your Instagram world, and that often really worries me, because if photographers are only going to be the people reading photographs, then are we just making sure that we exist in an echo chamber and pat ourselves on the back with like this is the best book of this year, you know, like, I mean, what does it mean to then have this book? Because the minute you create a book, you're talking about dissemination. You're talking about the fact that someone outside of your immediate world has the possibility to access it. Of course, there's many opinions which work, you know, the other way around, and I agree with that to a certain degree, where someone might just want to make 10 copies of something that they've produced because the work is such that they would like it to only remain within intimate circles. But largely speaking, you know, I don't know if people or if photographers or publishers are able to actually reach that point of access, that point of dissemination, which actually got them to use the book as a medium as well. And you know, I know you've been kind of also engaging with some aspects of distribution. You've published as well. So, I mean, I just wanted to know how that has been for you, A, within Australia, but also within the larger, I mean, I guess in some ways the whole world, because even within the States and Europe, the markets for consuming photo books are slowly kind of narrowing down. And I mean, I'm wondering, what does that mean for the book form, you know?
Well, I don't think the market is narrowing down. I think it was always narrow. I think
Right.
that's the thing. And I think, you know, the same thing is true in Europe and America too, is that it is a small community. And I guess the most interesting kind of models for books that have broken through that are really to do with stories, you know, and I think that's really something that all photographers are interested in, stories. So
Right.
it really depends on the project, and it really depends on how good that photographer is as getting that kind of work out there as well, in terms of marketing it, but also in terms of the way that the book kind of reads and the accessibility of the book itself, the way that it's structured, the way that someone who might come to it that doesn't know anything about photography can still engage with the story, and it doesn't kind of make them feel stupid, or doesn't make them feel like they don't understand what's going on, and it tells them the story that they need to be told, you know?
Right.
So I think there's a few things there though, in terms of, you know, if you talk to the biggest publishers in Europe, they will still say, well, there's only really 400 or 500 people that I know will buy this book, and the rest I've got to try and sell to people that would never buy a photo book normally, you know? I'm sure that's what Michael Mack has said
Right.
from Mack Publishing, you know? And so I think the key thing for me at the moment is, in this region, is actually not about 700 books, but it is about making 25 or 10 books, you know, for emerging photographers, and actually saying, okay, I'm going to make this really strong work. I'm going to invest in making this book really good. I'm going to make very small numbers. And then the idea is then to try and get it into the hands of people that actually might allow you then to produce a book of 1,000 copies and get an exhibition. And so, you know, there's examples of that with, of course, everybody, well, most people might know Reminders Photography Stronghold in Tokyo, run by Yumi Goto. And she's, you know, really been a kind of runner of that kind of model. They've been working also with SIBA editions. And so a number of the books that have come out of the Reminders Photography Stronghold in Japan, where they run workshops and they print and publish and make books there, and they've got got some amazing photographers that are producing really interesting kind of books, and I think some of those books have been so kind of well received in very small numbers, very rarely over 100. These books have been made in editions of, but they've been so well received in terms of international photography competitions and those sorts of kind of photography book lists that come out every year, that then publishers then have approached them saying, I actually like to do a trade edition version of this book, which means then 1,000 copies are done, or 1,500 or 750, whatever it might be. And then that takes them then to the next level of exhibitions and, you know, invites to various shows and that sort of stuff. So even though the photo book market might be a small one, I think what has happened is that there's a huge boom in photography festivals, in photography events, in photography related exhibitions all over the world. And so I think there's a huge market for photographers who are emerging to actually get their work out there in terms of competitions and book competitions and festivals, etc., and to engage in that community. and that then gives you the basis then to build on that to go to the next level with, you know, with a bit more money involved as well. But it takes time, and you know, that's one of the reasons that, again, like I said with the archive, is that, you know, a photographer who's, you know, a 21-year-old photographer from Manila is not going to be able to afford to print a book, publish a book, send it overseas to all these festivals, attend portfolio reviews in Houston or something, and then go to a festival, you know, go to a festival in Kyoto, and then also turn up to Melbourne to a festival. They just can't do it, right? But if they've got a really great book that they can then at least, you know, print really cheaply, and that's possible these days. You can do a really beautiful book printed really cheaply, just on, you know, just digital. And if it's good enough and it gets sent to the right people and get the right people see it, then it can actually start some stuff to happen, you know, and that's happened a lot, you know, in this region.
And, I mean, it's interesting also because, of course, a lot of what we're discussing is, you know, is methodologies that you've actually also helped with, you know, for certain books, you know, and we've seen some of the photo book pop-ups that you guys have done. I'm going to ask the maybe the most expected question in our current pandemic times is where does the library go now? You know, is a virtual book the same as a published book, and also does it even need to be, for that matter? I mean, you know, like a lot of people have been talking about how the book is now going online, and does that mean that it'll just become a PDF, or, you know? And I mean, personally, I feel that it has to find its own language when it, you know, when it uses the access point of the internet and the different, you know, modules within it. But where does the library or the archive, in that sense, move for you from here? You know, does it go online? Does it not go online? Are there more concerns than engagements that are possible today? You know, I think even if and when this COVID pandemic does leave us for a little bit of time at least, it's definitely a realization of how certain life patterns will probably change, how life structures are going to change. And so how do we ensure that that the book still stays what it intends to do? You know, the form obviously cannot stay one way, but what happens to the library and the photo book in this kind of a situation?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think, you know, the interesting thing is that many smarter people than me have tried to kind of work out how to make the photo book something that exists online, and to do, you know, interactive books, you know, interactive picture books, photo books, and to do iPad-based flip books that are, you know, and lots of things have been tried and none of them have really taken off. And I think it's fairly obvious why, is that, you know, the book is a tangible physical thing that people like to experience. But I think there's also, and I'll keep coming back to this notion of, you know, there is an economic kind of element to that too, is that, you know, there's an economic privilege to the thought that, yes, I'm going to buy that physical book because I just love that book and I want to hold it and I want to leaf through it every day and I want it on my shelf. And of course, we have to recognize that there's many millions, billions of people that don't have that kind of privilege. And I think that's what's really kind of exciting for me about being in this region, is that I think that there's so much growth possible there in terms of, I'm not talking about the books that have 500 copies or 700 copies. I'm talking about, you know, schools and colleges kind of allowing people to kind of explore photography just through their phones or whatever, and actually falling in love with the photographic image firstly. And then once you kind of hook someone with that, then you've got them, you know, because then it's a natural kind of step then to start looking at photo books and start looking at stories and start looking at how images work in terms of politics and society and love and all the things that kind of, you know, all the things that kind of connect us as human beings. And I think so in terms of the photo book, it's generally not the first thing that people engage with in photography. Usually it's photography and a film camera or a digital camera. And once they get through that, then it's like someone says, oh yeah, but have you seen this book by so-and-so? And then it's like, oh, forget about it. You know, once you show one person, you know, and this happens with my students all the time, you know, is that, you know, they might be studying for a year or 18 months at the college, and, you know, they're not really interested in books. And then, you know, they do a class with myself, or, you know, Katrin Koenig's teaching a class at the moment at PSC with Christian Hagblom in terms of photo books. And, you know, it just takes one book for that student to fall in love with, and that's them hooked for the rest of their lives, you know? And I think, and that's why it's really important to have access to these books. So that's why it's important to, you know, for me, it's important to attend those festivals in this region, so that people who turn up to, you know, Siem Reap, who are doing a photography workshop and they're 18 years old and they don't really know much about photography, then, you know, to create a space where they could sit down and look at a book, you know, for an hour and fall in love with it, that's my job done, really, you know?
Right.
And I think, you know, there's lots of, you talked about, you know, photo book libraries and things popping up everywhere. And I think that's really fantastic, you know, if it kind of gets people hooked, then I think that's the main thing. Because, you know, there's also a political kind of aspect to photo books and zines, if you like, you know, that, which, you know, if you're thinking about zines, I would say that they're ones that, you know, are kind of soft cover, they're A5, they're very kind of easy to produce and easy to kind of hand out. And there's a very kind of political nature to those too, you know, that traditionally, you know, going back hundreds of years, you had the pamphlet as a political kind of device. And that's really what the zine has become, you know, is this political kind of pamphlet that you can circulate, that's a political statement about something, or a social statement. And that's happening a lot too. You know, a lot of the zines I get at the archive are very political or very personal, and they're stuff that people just feel like they have to say. And even if it only circulates amongst, you know, 25, 30 people, those 25, 30 people show it to another 3 or 4 people each. Those people then talk about it to someone else, and it kind of grows and grows and grows. You know? And I've got plenty of zines in the archive that, you know, that I've shown at pretty much every event that I've done, because I just love them so much. You know, they're so simple and so powerful, but they're actually, you know, they're actually made for political reasons, you know?
Yes. And I mean, you didn't mention how you've engaged with the archive and your classes, your students, the work they're doing. I was just interested in knowing if if there is any specific programming that is that runs within the archive that looks at the educational aspect of photography as well. Considering you're of course the dean at one university, and you've also taught at at many other universities and held lectures or talks even over there. So how much of the archive comes into how you program for these talks, or how much of that gets to travel, or if there are any other programs that I might not even know of that you can share?
Yeah, well, I guess the archive does have a space in Melbourne. So Ying Ang, who you probably know as well, who's based here. So she's kindly given me this kind of space in her studio gallery called Le Space. Right. And so the archive is housed there. And so generally it's open to the public. So it's usually open on Saturdays, but at the moment, obviously, it hasn't been for a few months. Right. And as part of that space, it's open to the public to come and just spend time there. But we also have school and college groups coming through to visit as well. And so it's free for people to come and look at. It's free for colleges and universities to come and bring their students to come and look at the books. So that's certainly part of it. In terms of Photography Studies College, the archive is kind of separate. It's in a separate space. And I have my own collection of books at the college, which are not the archive. And then I have the archive because it's very separate things, you know.
And then you have your own personal collection of books, if I'm right.
Thousands, yes. Right. Yeah. I've got an office full of books as well, and I use a lot of the books from the archive for teaching purposes as well. So I'll bring them in and show them to students and that sort of stuff. But also when we go to festivals in different countries, we'll also do workshops. We've done photo book making workshops, so very technical, pragmatic kind of workshops. We've done photo book editing and sequencing workshops, and we've also just done workshops about photo books from different countries. We've also curated shows. So earlier this year, we curated a show of Taiwanese photography. So for a festival in New Zealand. So we curated a show of about 5 or 6 different photographers. And then I just basically did a call out to a load of publishers from, actually all the books are here behind me because I haven't put them back in the archive yet because they're sitting.
Oh, wow. Okay, you've got a lot there.
Yeah. So then I put a call out to publishers from Taiwan that I knew of, and they had some books of theirs already. So La Maison de Z, which I think the founder actually lives in Paris, but also in, and I think it was Chinese and Taiwanese photo books actually as well.
Okay.
So I think she's from Beijing originally, and then we had DMP editions, and we had,
sorry,
of
what's
course,
DMP?
DMP editions. So it's a Taiwanese publisher.
Okay.
And we had the Voices of Photography magazine, which is a Taiwanese photography magazine, which is amazing.
Yeah.
So we took that, and I'm going to forget other people we took also, but lots of different publishers from China and Taiwan, and we did a big show of Chinese and Taiwanese photo books at this gallery in New Zealand, and then did a couple of talks and did a kind of program around the exhibition as well. So there's a variety of things we do when we go to events, but also when we're kind of here in Melbourne at the same time. Right. And like, you know, a few years ago, we did kind of a takeover of the Photographers Gallery bookshop in London. So they gave us kind of this massive table in the bookshop, and we just kind of I brought over 2 massive suitcases of books, and we just basically filled the bookshop with all these books from the Asia-Pacific region. None of them were for sale because we don't sell any books. Right. And so it's great to see all these confused people coming into the bookshop and looking through all these great books and getting a big stack of books they wanted to buy. And then I'd say, I'm sorry, they're not for sale. But if you want to buy them, you can go directly to the photographer's website and buy them from them. And, you know, and so giving them all the links they need to buy. And I think that's really important too, is that, you know, we don't engage in sales. And I think that's kind of key to what we're doing, because I think if we started selling books, then it would become a very different arrangement with the photographers. You know, it's much more about just having one copy and trying to get that seen as many places as possible. Right. And I think, you know, the nature of being a traveling kind of archive is that the books travel and therefore sometimes get damaged. And I think I was going to ask you about that. How do you manage that? Because I think it was just something. It was something Bella and I sort of talked about really, and it's like, well, we have 2 choices. It's either in Melbourne and only people in Melbourne see the books, or it's traveling and it gets damaged. Which would we prefer? Well, of course, we prefer it to travel and get damaged, you know? Yeah. So we're very careful with the books, and we have very specific kind of conditions that we put on people when we're sending a box of books to festivals, and the way that they have to be displayed, all that sort of stuff. And so, you know, we are as careful as we can be. But of course, when you have books that are just kind of thin paper that are just kind of folded, you know, with no cover, and you know, they're going to get, you know, but that's okay. I think, you know, I'd rather 2,000 people see a book and it get a little bit damaged than, you know, 20 people see it. You know? Fair enough. And I know your programming for these few months has definitely gone for a complete toss owing to the shutdown, and I believe you guys are you still under a lockdown? Because when we spoke last, the archive was definitely shut and not opening anytime soon. Yeah, that's right. We've gone even further into lockdown in Melbourne now, so we're totally locked down. So you're not even allowed to leave the house really. I think we can leave the house for 1 hour a day to go shopping. Okay. Well, so everyone's working from home. All the classes at the college are from home. So it's happening another month or so. It's happening for, and then we'll see where we're at, I think. Well, I hope the end of the month allows for things to open up slowly and carefully, but for some movement and some engagement to be there, and for the archive to open back up, and hopefully some of those who've joined us from Australia, although I'm sure they already know about the archive, can revisit, let's just say, you know, the space. And I've seen some images of Ying Space, and I'm quite excited to see the archive there as well. I mean, I've not seen images of
your current install there. But I'm quite looking forward to seeing some more stuff happen.
Yeah.
We did go over time on what we had scheduled, so I'm just gonna it does happen. I'm gonna take if anyone has any questions, you can please address them to the Q&A and the chat section, and we'll quickly try. I know it's really late for you. It's probably heading to close to midnight that side, is it?
11:30. That's okay.
Okay, so we're not gonna keep you up for too long. Oh, David is here for this talk. Hi, David. Great to not see you, but know that you're on the other end of this webinar. David has just said, I was wondering if you could talk about things you're doing or trying to make photo books more accessible to the wider public beyond the usual photo book crowd. That is reading rooms, education, fun, etc. I know we just kind of went through that with you. Is there anything else that you might want to add on the non-photo crowd, or is there anything at all that you might want to add to that?
Not really. I mean, I think that's the big question, and I think that's where those kind of events. There's a big festival planned for Melbourne in 2021,
Right.
and hopefully that will kind of engage the broader community in photography, really. So I think like I said, I think photo books, it's part of the photography scene. So I think if we can engage more people in photography, then they'll naturally kind of progress into kind of looking at photo books too. Yeah, and I think what's really interesting for me, and I have started some conversations already with a few people in the region, and just about there aren't that many photography schools as well in the Asia-Pacific region. If you think about
Right.
a number of a number of schools that do exist around the region. There's some great schools, obviously, but I think but I think there's an interesting kind of dynamic in that there are some schools that exist that kind of teach photography, but when they teach photography, they're just thinking about it in a kind of very commercial sense. So it's photography within a kind of technology and media kind of space, which is fine. But I think the interesting thing is that I think over the next kind of 10, 15 years, you'll start to see more kind of art schools pop up and more kind of photography colleges that are interested in engaging in kind of contemporary photography practice and how it fits in with other medium and also photo books and those things. So I think I'm really excited to kind of work with some people I've been talking to in the last couple of years about kind of pushing education in the region more in that way and away from, I think the education for photographers traditionally has been kind of training photographers,
Right.
And certainly that's not, the case with like Pathshala or with other places, of course. But there are plenty of schools that don't do that and are very much around kind of training photojournalists or training kind of commercial photographers. And I think, which has its own place, but I think there's a lot of growth there to kind of really give people that kind of broader perspective on what photography is,
Right.
So I think also in the region, there's been traditionally that kind of notion of the kind of master and the student as well. It's like there's the master photographer who then trains all the students to be just like him. Usually, it's usually a him, and I think that's kind of fading away as well a bit. And I think there's more kind of diversity in terms of teaching and practices as well in terms of teaching.
Right. That's nice to know. If I may, I'm just add to that, David. I think because you were talking about education, I think for Offset, one of the reasons that we actually did come into being, for a very large reason, in fact, was to look at how photography can go outside of photographers. So, I mean, we do have a library, and the library is a small element of what we do. But what we do aim for is actually to use the library to go into non-photo-based universities and do kind of like these pop-up library settings for like a week, where we also, I mean, the nature of books that we do carry for such curations is very different. We'll probably take from Nepal, we might take the Dalit book, we might take the Monsanto book, we might take something that deals with transgender identity. And then we actually, let's say, invite students of like a sociology department or a literature department to also begin to understand how the photo book can also come as part of your research, as part of your project thesis, and also looking at, I mean, specifically in India, and this is something that I think I am particularly affected by, is how, as maybe across the world, we're also receiving images and what it means for people to really know the importance of the way in which you can interpret the same image. I mean, it's becoming a pretty big methodology for journalistic communication, for activism today. And I think it becomes really important for people to know what the baggage of the image and the photo book can be in this dynamic. So we do actually, we do have workshops that are for photographers. We do have, we try and find platforms where there are festivals that are not photo festivals, but maybe an art-based festival or a book fair, where we try and kind of insert the photo book and hope that, you know, people who are, I don't know, maybe trying to pick up a Salman Rushdie might instead, you know, gravitate towards the cover of The Coast. You know, who knows? So we try that. We've also,
That's a big step, isn't it? That's a
it
big
is,
step
it's
from
not
Salman Rushdie to Sarabpura. That's a big step.
you know, it's a massive step, but there's always hope. You know, and actually, I mean, one of the closest spaces, although it wasn't very drastically different, was at the India Art Fair. We actually set up a space for independently produced, self-published books. And it was in 3 days, we sold about 10, 15 copies of each title, which was
Right.
unimaginable. You know,
Yeah.
I literally asked the authors to give me like 2, 3 copies because I wasn't too sure how this was going to go. But I think it's also taking them into a space, looking at different festivals that also engage with thought and content differently. I've also been working with, we did have a first art book fair in India this year. So we were, Offset was doing the programming for that and slowly pushing them to kind of grow more and more so that we can incorporate more people. But so at these festivals, what we try and do is that we also try and do workshops that are not meant for photographers. So whether it's a fun zine making workshop on how you can look at an archive. We get artists to bring in their work and get workshop participants to completely dismantle that work and make their own work out of it. And actually, what's been very interesting is that for the workshop that we did have in Jaipur, the non-photography people who joined in allowed themselves to play a lot more with the image than the photography people. Suddenly you had photographers being completely zapped with this idea of, so I can just take any images and make my own thing out of it. Whereas, you had kids and you had like this lady who was a housewife and you had like someone else who was, just passing by, and they were happily like destroying images, making new stuff. Which is, I guess, important learning for me, because I had always imagined the other way around. So I guess, we're, in many ways, Offset is also more of an experiment. So I think it allows us to really expand. We do residencies with non-photographers as well. So last year, we actually had a residency with a linguist whose specialization is actually in culinary histories and sociology. And we asked them to come and do a 1-month residency in Goa where we also do workshops. And she actually was trying to chart out the visual history in some ways of regional rice in the village that she was in, But I think, they bring about interesting intersections of thought and subject to even look at.
But I think what's interesting also is that, that sort of stuff, and I think certainly this is what I've found with the archive, is that this sort of stuff, it takes 5, 10, 15 years to have an effect. So you think, if you look at Angkor Photo Festival now, which has been running for a long time, or the festival that Shahidul runs. Sorry, the name's gone now.
Chobi Mela?
Chobi Mela, yeah, sorry. That it's been going for a long time, right? And I think that project, it grows photographers in the next generation, you know? So that's also,
Right.
so what you're doing now, you know, in 5 years time, someone comes back to you and says, oh yeah, well, I saw the pop-up thing you did at the art fair in 2020 or 19. And
Right.
so that's when I fell in love with photography, and then I decided to go and do this somewhere, and then I studied photography, and then I've done this, and now I'm doing whatever it might be, you know?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's
It
how
takes a
I
long
got
time.
into this field, you know.
Exactly.
So, like,
It takes a long time for that stuff to grow. And I think, you know, that's what's really exciting, that, you know, the most festivals that have popped up in the last 10 years have been in this region, you know? There's festivals everywhere now in this region. And I think that's amazing, you know? And that means that, you know, in 10 years time, there's 5 years time, there's going to be a whole kind of generation of photographers that have just, you know, happened to be walking along the streets of you know, Siem Reap and wandered into an exhibition and then picked up photography. And, you know, you can see that already with people that are winning awards and people that are getting exhibitions overseas, that they're coming out of these places, they're coming out of these festivals where they've done a workshop with Sohrab, or they've done a workshop with Katrin, or they've done a workshop with, you know, whoever, Ian Tay or something, you know, and
right.
they've then gone on to do other things. And there's plenty of those stories even now, and
Yeah.
that will just keep growing, you know.
Yeah, no, definitely. I'm just going to move to Deshna's question, and she wanted to know, how is the archive funded, if I may ask? Is it other endeavors of the co-founders that supports it, or do you have a patron? Is it a self-sustaining model? Would be most grateful if you could share this with us. Thank you both for the conversation this far and the insights.
So at the very start, we did have some, I did apply for and get some funding from Victoria, which is the state that Melbourne is in.
Okay.
A little bit of funding, and from Australia Council, we've had a couple of grants, but very small, $1,000 here and there.
Okay.
Sometimes we've had spaces where we've had to pay rent, and so I've just paid rent. At the moment, we have Ying is our patron, so she's hosting us in her space. And I think that's to do with her also being interested in, you know, supporting and building a community of photographers, not only in Australia, but also in the kind of region. And she's certainly got things planned for that space as well, in terms of the gallery that she's got there. But yeah, is it a self-sustaining model? Well, I guess so. I mean, I guess at the moment I'm trying to do it as cheaply as possible. And when I do go to festivals, generally, if I'm going to a festival, I'm going to a festival to do something. So I'm going to either judge a prize, or I'm doing a workshop, or I'm doing a talk. So sometimes I pay for myself to go to the festival. Sometimes the festival pays for me to go. Sometimes the college, you know, PSC pays for me to go to a festival. Sometimes I take students along. So I think it's been a bit of everything, really. But certainly we don't have a rich patron. If you know of one, I'd be happy to have
Please
a chat.
direct them right to Daniel.
Yeah, so it's really, you know, we just go year by year, really, and there's no real, I mean, generally, I'd say probably 60% of the books have been donated, and about 40% I've bought. And so I buy books anyway. And so generally, if I'm buying books from the region, then I'll just put them into, I'll put them as archive books, and they'll go into the archive. And you know, if I really love them, then I might buy 2 copies and keep one for myself as well.
That was going to be my question after the talk. How do you decide which book, when you're buying it, how do you decide which one goes into the archive and which one goes into your personal collection?
Well, generally they're all in the archive. The books that I have in my personal collection generally are books that don't belong in the archive, so they're not from the region, if you like, you know. So the books I've just collected from other countries and those. Okay. So generally, everything that's from this region is in the archive.
That's really good to know. That means. Yeah. And do you have any idea, like roughly speaking, how many books do you have in the archive?
Well, it's actually been a really difficult year this year. So generally, we try and post the books up on the website. So the website has a list of all the books, but we're probably about a year behind on posting, just because this year's been horrible. And the end of last year, we were in between spaces and we were moving. So we haven't had a concerted effort to kind of post all the books that have arrived in the last kind of year, really. So we've been posting about them on Instagram and Facebook and everything, but we haven't actually put them up to the website. but I think we're probably close to about 2,500 books, something like that.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's encouraging. It's good to know that there have been so many that have gotten to you.
And most of the books I get actually are from when I go to festivals. So when I go to festivals and meet people and do talks, and then people just kind of give me books, or they or I buy a book from them, depending on what's happening.
Right.
But generally, it's really worth to go to the festivals. Say again?
I was saying shipping can be quite a task for
That's right. Yeah, and that's really hard, and that comes down to, that's where it's really important for me to go to those things and to attend, because it is really difficult for people to get their books out there.
No, most definitely. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this today, Daniel. Tonight, in your case, hopefully I've not taken you over to the next day on your side of the calendar.
It's all good.
And, but thank you so much. Thank you everyone who's joined us today. And if any of you have any questions, I think Daniel will be more than happy to answer them. What I can do is maybe I can share the website, and I think it's info@Photobook Asia Archive, right? For the email ID.
Info@Photobook Archive.
Photobook Archive, right?
The website is just Photobook Archive. Yeah.
Yes, Photobook Archive. So you can, if any of you have any books or any suggestions, Deshna, if you have any patron who you could forward.
She's looking for one herself, she said on the message. Yeah.
Maybe we need to organize and figure out a community of patrons that we can put together and then kind of attack them together. David, do you have any suggestions here? But it would be nice to keep in touch, and I'm so glad to know that you have an ever-growing archive of books from the region. Thank you for joining us today, and I hope you have a nice sound sleep with sweet dreams that come to you tonight. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone else who's joined us. We will be back on Friday with the Sister Library, which is actually based out of Bombay. Have you heard of them before, Daniel?
No, I haven't, but I looked them up after I saw them listed on the...
It's a very interesting library of its own sort. It's India's only, I'd imagine, feminist library. So it's not just photography, but it's photo books, it's art books, it's literature, it's everything by women, which we're very happy to kind of get to know more about. So I hope we'll see you on Friday, same time.
Thank you, Anshika, for inviting me, and thank you for the talk. It was great, and also well done on the talks you're putting on. I've been watching a few of them, and they're great.
Thank you.
Yeah, they're really interesting.
We're hoping we can keep finding interesting aspects and conversations to put out. But yeah, it would be lovely to have you back for a different kind of a conversation, maybe, or different kinds of collaborations. Thank you, and good night, everybody. See you.
See ya.